She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand. Hold up on she frack, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For the morning, the day is dawning. For Cockacrow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Cockacrow.
All right. Hey, good day, everyone. My name is Mark Benchap, and it's Anansi Web Education. We have no strangers to you guys. The former president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, His Excellency David Arthur Granger, is with us again, as usual. And then we have, from last week to now, we have Wayne Caesar, no stranger to you guys, also public accountant. And we have somebody who might be running for some office in Brooklyn or somewhere, who knows, Attorney Shalon Washington. How are you guys doing today?
Great.
Good
Good to
morning.
be here again.
Yeah,
Good
good to
morning,
see
Mark.
you guys
We're doing
again.
well.
Let's get straight into the thing. Let me ask, how was the Emancipation Day celebrations for you folks?
For me, it was great. I was on vacation anyway, so I saw some of the celebrations online. But I had a great Emancipation Day.
How about you, Wayne?
Yeah, well, I took some time, to reflect on everything on the day and, the meaning of the day. And also took some time to watch some of the festivities down in Guyana. So it was pretty good. Pretty good day.
Good. Glad to hear that. Of course, Mr. Granger, how did you spend the day, August 1st?
Well, I've been away from public engagements for a while, and again, I saw it at a distance.
Got you. At a distance, indeed. Let's get straight into our what we will be discussing today. What are the three things we will be dealing with for this half hour? What are the most common and visible features of African Guyanese culture today? That's one. The other one is, how have African Guyanese been able to preserve their culture for over 200 years? And the third and final one, why should African Guyanese cultural practices be preserved? That's an important question. But let's get first to deal with number one, with what are the most common and visible features of African Guyanese culture today? Let's begin opening the batting, Mr. Granger. Take a first shot at that.
Well, in the first instance, you can distinguish African Guyanese by their appearance. They look different to Amerindians or other groups. But seriously, as far as the culture is concerned, I would reckon that you can look at yardsticks such as the speech. There is a way of speaking, and there are certain terms that they use, language, which you can recognize, the types of food that they eat, and the relations that they have with other members of society. And, I feel that the communities tend to be, more harmonious, less conflictual. And I think those are the most outstanding characteristics. When you hear them speak, when you see what they eat, and when you see the way they form friendships, all these things are distinctive. Food and language and religion. In the past, on a Sunday, you go into an African village, it's silent as night. Everybody's in church or at home drinking some soup. But nowadays, I think things have changed. But those used to be distinctive characteristics when I was growing up.
I was going to say that today. Sunday pass into some of them villages now is big boom boom going on. Things have changed indeed. Let's get straight to Mr. Caesar. Wayne Caesar, that same question to you. Before we get to Shalon, it's what are the most common and visible features of African Guyanese culture today, sir?
Yeah, for me, Mark, that would be, the villages. They stand out. Victoria, Pleasance, the Mockers, You know, these villages really stand out as, African Guyanese villages. They have a rich history behind them. And what also stands out for me, Mark, is, some of the things that, common employment among, Africans today. Even today, it still do exist to an extent. We do small stock rearing, goats, sheeps, sometimes larger stock. We still have provision farmers out there and farmers in general. So we're still doing some of the things that would have been done back in Mr. Granger time. It's still happening today, but not on
And I'm hoping, Wayne, I'm sorry about that.
I'm not ancient.
I'm not. No, no, no. It's not an age thing here. Not on the scale that he would have accustomed seen it, but on a much smaller scale. We still have babysitters around. A lot of the African women, when they first leave to go out of the home for employment, because most of the time the men work, when they first left the home to go out, for employment, it was either babysitting or you go in and clean a house and wash some clothes and these type of things. And this type of employment still exists to an extent. So I think it really marks, where we would have come from, and it is ingrained in our culture.
Well said. Well said indeed, Mr. Caesar. A little bit of hiccup there. When you did say back in Mr. Granger's time, I thought we were going to have that village fight right here today, cutlass and picket. Miss Washington, go right ahead, please. Your take.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Mark. And I would have to lean a lot more on what the Honorable President Granger said regarding the most common and visible feature of African Guyanese culture. I think the food, most importantly, that is absolutely very much visible. If you visit Ghana, if tourists visit Ghana, one of the things that they will see is our food, our culture is embedded in our food. When the Africans left Africa and they came, they didn't come willingly, they were sent to Guyana. Part of what they preserved is the way they ate, and ground provision, the metamg, the cook-up rice, those are all things that came directly from African culture, and it's embedded in our Afro-Guyanese culture. So that is very much visible, because you go to almost every single household in Guyana these days, and that's something you'll see readily, what they're cooking and what they're eating. You'll see the cook-up rice, you'll see the metamg, those are a part, and you see the bacon saltfish that also came from the Afro-Guyanese culture. And secondly, the other thing that I would say that is very, very much visible is the music. I would add the art also, but I think the music is more so bigger than the art, because every single festivity Afro-Guyanese have, you will hear the drums, the comfort drums. Those drums came from Africa with them when they came, and they retain that part of their culture. It has never been severed from any type of celebration. Any celebration you see Afro-Guyanese have, even the Emancipation Day celebration, there's drum. Even in our religion, Afro-Guyanese religion, the drums are a very, very big part of what they do and how we celebrate part of our culture. So, those things are things I borrowed from what the Honorable President Granger just mentioned. Those are rich, and it's evident there. You don't have to look very far to see those things. It's evident, it's still alive, and it's most visible, as far as I can tell, in our Guyanese culture. Back to you, Mark.
Okay, I think Mark is out. So
No, we are the subject matter is basically about the village. And we in the village, and somebody got to come and whistle in the village, ring the bicycle bell and call you out. You got to run out. But that's what happened just now in the village. Speaking of that, now I remember back in the villages out there, and Mr. Granger spoke about the way we talk, that you're able to differentiate who is from where. I knew when somebody was from Linden or somebody was from Belladrum. Oh, and E and he and who and and the other thing is too, in the villages we used to sit down and the tantalizing. I couldn't stand that tantalizing stuff at all. But those were good things in the villages, And we have had that sort of experience. You talked about the food, and Wayne talked about the fact that the men would just go off wherever, wander off. But those are good examples, really, really good examples. And for those of you who are now joining us, welcome to this program. It's Anansi Web Education with me, no strangers. You see them all there, Mr. Granger, Miss Shellon Washington, Mr. Wayne Caesar. We dealt first with what are the most common and visible features of African Guyanese culture today. Do we still have it? Do we still see it? Is it still strong? Which leads me to our next topic here. How have African Guyanese been able to preserve their culture for over 200 years? Over 200 years, and that's the important thing. Let's go right back to Mr. Granger to take a shot at that one.
Well, to start with, culture was not something that was invented. The subculture was not invented. It's something people grew up with. It's something that emerged from experiences. Don't forget that after emancipation, people had some retentions of what took place in the homeland in terms of the state thing Shalon mentioned, the speech, people still spoke about sense fowls or eating kanki or fufu or metemji. These are authentic African words, and the retentions were there, the drumming was there, and people, of course, at emancipation time and other festivities would put on kente cloth, usually kente cloth or some other form of African dress. And there was a way of speaking, there was a way of relating with elders in the community. And I think that is important. But what we should bear in mind is that what our parents and grandparents did was a matter of necessity. Going to church was not optional when you were young, it was an obligation. So we became Christians because we were sent to church. I'm as a chorister, and if I had time, I would sing for you all. But apart from that, we saw the foods that they ate the foods were foods that they produced. They ate what they grew, and they grew what they wanted, what they had to eat. So that was a necessity. So I think that the culture was preserved for such a long period of time because what they were doing was necessary, and to some extent it was the only way they knew to do things. They belonged to a home, and the family lived together in that home. There were no street children, there were no beggars, there were no destitute people, there were no homeless people. They went to church, and depending on the community, there was a dominant church, whether it's a congregational church or a Catholic church or Anglican church. They all went to church on Sundays. They all knew something about farming. They didn't flee from the farms as some people thought. They all grew up, with a little kitchen garden. So wherever they went, they would always try to do something to eat. And of course, most villagers were reasonably literate. They went to school, even though every now and then they would skulk and go swimming or go raiding somebody's mango trees. But those four pillars that sustained or upheld the villages were embraced by all the villagers, and that's how the children grew up. And generation after generation, that is what they learned to do. Somebody became congregationalist simply because the parents were congregational. Of course, now things have changed because we've been through a transition, and people go into evangelical churches, many of which didn't exist 100 years ago. People cease farming because they have to find work in Georgetown or Linden. Or if you're in Linden, maybe you're working in the mines, or if you're an accountant or a doctor, you don't go in the farm, milking cows at 6 o'clock in the morning. So the culture continued out of necessity. And when people got the opportunity to migrate or to transition to some other type of employment, it started to change. But the memories were still there. But if you go into the villages now, you'd feel at home, in terms of the way people deal with one another, the amount of aunties and uncles, and if you're nearby, you can't miss a funeral. It was it was anathema to miss an auntie's funeral or some relative's funeral. The funerals were important, but all these are part of the culture that we inherited and that we continued and passed on to our children.
Well said, David Arthur Granger, former president of Guyana. If you're now joining us, this is Anansi Web Education with us this week, last week also, Wayne Caesar and Miss Shalon Washington. Mr. Granger said something that's very interesting, but we are going to take him up on that a little bit later in this program. He says that if he has the time, he will sing for us. As we say in Guyana, he will bust a tune for us. We'll get back to that. Ms. Washington, the same question. How have African Guyanese been able to preserve their culture, and in quotation mark, their culture for over 200 years?
Right. A lot of what the president said is essentially what causes a culture in any society to emerge from their experiences, from their history, their practices. And I think one of the things, like I said earlier, the Africans were able to bring with them is part of their culture. So even though their language was taken and they were forced to speak another language, some of their culture was still embedded in them, and they were able to essentially still practice it and pass it on to their children. So I think one of the things that helped to preserve culture is, is tradition. You pass a tradition down from generation to generation. And, the president did say that, going to church was a necessity. And that's part of tradition. If someone goes or if they practice something, they're going to pass that to their children and then the children to the grandchildren. And I think tradition is what is part of what kept our culture going. And apart from our tradition, another thing that's really important, I think, that kept our culture going is oral history. I think some of the things I learned from my past generation is from what my mother told me, and she was told by somebody else. So oral tradition or oral history is part of what keeps a culture going from generation to generation. But not only that, now in our times, fortunately, we have people who write. At some point there were no books, history books about Guyanese culture, about much of our history. There were Caribbean books about Caribbean history, but now we have people like the Honorable David Granger writing books. We have other writers, other authors writing books about Guyana, history and the tradition. And I think the Honorable Granger has a lot of history in his head. So I think it's a good thing that he's passing that type of history down to our generation and future generations in Ghana so that they can learn some of the practices, some of the culture, some of the things, because some of the things he has told us or taught about on this program, I myself didn't know because it wasn't written in a book. Up to when, we have author like him now writing about these things, so people can now read and understand where our history come from and how we're helping to preserve it through writings now, through oral history and through tradition. I think those are some of the major ways we've been able to preserve our culture and continue it, even though to some extent some of the younger generations are not practicing. I think rightfully, like President Granger said, some of the villages, which I should visit because I would love to see the richness of our culture in those villages. But those are the major ways I think we were able to preserve most of our culture.
Well said, Shalon Washington. And for those who are now joining us, this is Anansi Web Education. Some of you might have memories of the cultures in African villages and so forth. And the question is, how have we been able to maintain that for over 200 years? One of the things that I would mention that I really love, but I don't necessarily participate in it, the first time I participated in it, I wanted my money up front. That's Boksan. And that's how our ancestors were able to pull up their resources, the Boksan. It started way back then, and I just wish that we could just stop fight to see who will get first hand and second hand and these sort of things. So I love the Boksan, but just for the first hand. Mr. Wayne Caesar, let's get your takes here.
Yeah, Mark, in continually preserving our history. I think that starts with our everyday life, making, our history a part of our everyday life. That way we can live it day after day. And also, history is allowed to be carried on because we have museums and libraries and these places that would be carrying important information of the history of the Africans and the Atlantic slave trade, amongst other things. And as Shalon and His Excellency would have pointed out, there is a lot of reading literature that is available, poems, amongst other things that represents our culture and where we would have come from. But I think one of the key things is the imparting of our cultural knowledge to the next generation. And for the most part, that is done at school and at home. I remember earlier, growing up, there was a great emphasis on the communal values such as family, respect for your elderly, honoring past and present traditional rulers, and just the importance of dignity and proper social conduct in the family structure. And I feel like if that is part of our culture, and in moving forward, we have to, keep in line as a social group, as a community, you know, family obligations, as I remembered it, used to take precedence over everything else. And that was a part of our social construct, which ultimately tied in to our history. So, as a people, I think our history is carried on for the most part because we live it every day.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wayne Caesar. We do live it every single day, and we have to be able to maintain that. Again, hello to all of you who are now joining us on Anansi Web Education. Wayne mentioned respect for elders and so forth. I remember that was big back in the days, at least when I was growing up. You couldn't talk to anybody older than you, whether it's 2 years, 3 years. You had to show them that respect. And even the older folks, you couldn't, and they had an obligation to flog you or discipline you whenever necessary. It doesn't happen these days, and that's one of the things that maybe we have to go back and ensure that we maintain it. And I'm a big advocate for that now. You couldn't have me doing that back then, but now I'm older now. I see the need for people respecting us, and so I'm a big advocate on that. Mr. Granger, you did promise to run a 2 lines for us before we deal with the final question for this.
But let's skip that. Yeah?
Keep your promise, sir. Go right ahead. Let's get a nice line from you. Go ahead. Let's hear you.
No, let's skip that. We're running out of time.
All right, we will skip it. Okay, we got you. Before the end of the program, we probably will get that. But as we look at our final topic for today, why should African Guyanese cultural practices be preserved? And that's a big question. Why? Why? In every other ethnic groups, they don't have a problem preserving their cultures and so forth, their cultural practices, but we need to do that as well. And this is an important question here. Why should African Guyanese cultural practices be preserved? Why? Shalon.
I think, Mark, our culture is what gives us a sense of identity, a sense of who we are, a sense of our togetherness. I think one of the things that happened when the Africans were stripped from their homeland and forcibly taken to the Caribbean is that the sense of identity was partly stripped away from them. Part of who they were, part of where they came from was stripped. And then when you take Afro-Guyanese to a new environment, a new country, impose a new language on them. Now they were forced to figure out a new roadmap as to, who they are and what are they going to do now. And, even though they were able to recall some of their culture, recall some of the practices that they did in Africa, it doesn't take away from the fact that now they were forced into a new environment where a new culture actually emerged. The Guyanese, Afro-Guyanese culture, although it resembles some of the things that were done in Africa, it's not quite the same. It's something that has emerged over, many, many years. And this is unique to us, our own culture that we have now. And I think we need to preserve it. Preserving your history, preserving your culture is very important as a people. It's your roadmap. History is our roadmap that shows us where we came from and where we're going. And I think one of the things Wayne and Mark mentioned earlier, that we live our history every day. I'm telling you, I certainly don't want to live my history every day, because the part that I think no one wants to ever again in their existence, experience is the slavery part. So we don't want to live that part, but we want to live the rich part, the part that tells us where we came from, the part that tells us about our food, about the clothing we wear, about the music we love, about the arts that we enjoy creating. Those are all part of our rich Guyanese culture. And I think it's very, very important that we do not lose our identity as to who we are as a people, and we find ways and means, and even the government of Ghana need to facilitate Afro-Guyanese in preserving their culture, because without Afro-Guyanese being taken to Ghana, I don't think Ghana would have been what it is today. We are an intricate part of the foundation of our country. So I think those are all reasons, good reasons, why Afro-Guyanese culture needs to be preserved.
Well said, Miss Washington. Some of you in the audience might have your own ways. But when we are done with this show today, just go on into your villages, wherever you're from, whether it's Philippi, whether it's Evesham, Epsom, Linden, Ituni, Kokwani, wherever, Buxton, Friendship, Victoria, Pleasant, wherever you're from, go about preserving that cultural practices. You've got to do it. Mr. Granger.
Well, I would like to go back to something Wayne mentioned and what you were speaking about also. I think Wayne mentioned the importance of having maybe museums or libraries in every village. And I know that some villagers have started to write the histories of their villages. Not many, unfortunately. If in any village you were able to see a cultural center and you can see the history of that village. I know in Plaisance, the Independence Monument has a list of some of the councillors who were present at the time of independence, and I think there's one at Rose Hall on the quarantine. But a characteristic of those African Guyanese villages is the number of monuments. I mean, if you go into the churchyard at Litchfield, I think, yes, you'll see a monument with some of the founders of the village, including Kojo McPherson. I mean, it's there forever. And I can name you a dozen villages with monuments, stone monuments, which are built by the villagers, of course, many years ago. People don't seem to do that sort of thing anymore. So Wayne made an important point in having these institutions erected to perpetuate the memory of the people. But it's important that some institution, we don't believe just in one person, who's gone away and come back and made contributions to children and so on. I think it should be a task that is embraced by all of the villagers to perpetuate that memory, because the values that were taught or that were inculcated were important in forging social cohesion. So that is what, and I know we're winding up now. In fact, in winding up, I would like to remind the listeners and the viewers that the name of this program is Anansi Web Education. And Anansi is one of the smallest and weakest creatures in the jungle. but he's the smartest. And Anansi was able to overcome the tigers and lions and snakes and the bigger creatures by being intelligent. So Anansi's intelligence was used to help, other animals to survive or to overcome cruel and bigger beasts. And similarly, in Guyana, the African Guyanese communities had to fight against the British planters and win independence. It was a great victory, but at the same time, you had weak, almost universally illiterate persons who were able to literally bring the well-armed planters to defeat and drive them out of the controlling positions in the economy. So that is important. That is why we should preserve. That's why the name is important, and that is why we should preserve our culture, because the culture is not only one of resistance, but it's also one of resilience and one of cohesion among the people. So that is a very, very good reason for the preserving of our culture. And I endorse Wayne's idea that in every community, no matter how humble it is, there should be some little reading room or a museum or a library where visitors could go and see the history of that village. So I just like to add that to what Shalon and Wayne have said.
Thank you so much. As we go down, just got a few minutes before we wrap up on today's program of Anansi Web Education. Wayne, why should African Guyanese cultural practices be preserved? Why, sir?
Well, Mark, I would say it's imperative that African Guyanese culture be preserved because it plays a massive part when we look at Guyana and its rich history. And we can go all the way back and start with emancipation. Because if you look back at emancipation, if that would not have occurred, we would not be sitting here probably in this position today. But it has happened, and it has happened because of the African Guyanese. And they would have done much more, and has quite a bit of history, in Guyana. I would say the African Guyanese and our first people, the indigenous people, would have a great deal to play when it comes to the history. And listen, all ethnic groups across the board, but these two ethnic groups really stand out because they were the first that were there. And they would have faced the brunt, of what, the Europeans would have met it out. So, it's important that our history stay alive. And like Sharon would have said, yes, we want our history to stay alive. We wanna live it every day. And I agree with Sharon. We want to live the good part of it every day because we would have come a very, very long way as a people. But at the same time, we don't want to forget what we would have gone through to get to this point. So I agree again with both Shalon and His Excellency. It's important to have literature available, to have short videos available. And I'm happy that His Excellency is writing books on the history of Guyana. Maybe we may get a Shalon Washington book down the road. I'll wait to see. But yeah, our history is rich, Mark, and we need to continue to push along and keep our history alive. It's very, very important also to the generations to come. So we need to continue to impart the knowledge.
Well said, Wayne. And contributions made by all of you guys today, rich indeed. And I'm sure that our members out there in the audience listening, whether in Guyana, outside of Guyana, wherever you guys are, I'm sure you guys have so much that you can add to what was said today to preserve the African cultural practices. It needs to be preserved. And one of the things that I do, especially in my home, is that I remind my kids, or I teach my kids, for example, Emma, because not many of them want to follow that, right? Jonathan, for example, Jonathan says he's American, that's it. But Emma, I always try to take her back from a historical standpoint, Guyana, cultural standpoint, Guyana and Linden. And I've noticed Jonathan started to research Guyana. He's talking about the villages now. And I'm mentioning these sort of things because it is important. It starts right in the home. And if it's not being done in the villages, we got to put it back in the villages because that will help to preserve the cultural practices. Not just pointing, if you point your finger at a passing horse, your finger gonna drop out, you gotta bite all your fingers and these things. That's a superstitious thing. And I know Mr. Granger familiar with Auckland Cemetery there. He probably as a little boy, not so long ago, he was afraid to point at the cemetery. And he's laughing. That's probably true. But we got to find ways indeed in preserving our cultural practices. We've got to, and it starts in the home. Parents, no matter how little it is, no matter how small it might appear, always ensure that you teach your kids something about the cultural, whether it's food, whether it's practice. And the culture is not necessarily songs such as, because I thought that Zungu 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 Zing was Yellow Man. I'm sure that Mr. Granger probably didn't even get time with Zungu Zungu. But in the villages, Manchester, Lancaster, Liverpool, that's all. And we thought that that was just the African culture. Zungu Zungu, way probably too young for Zungu Zungu. Chelan probably was busy in the church, didn't get time with Zungu Zungu. But those of us from Manchester and Lancaster, we thought that that was just the African culture because we weren't really taught a lot about our culture. And this is what Wayne, Chelan, and Mr. Granger, all of you spoke about that. And I'm sure folks in the audience would agree that we need to get back. Not just the songs like Zungu Zung, and I'm not knocking that, but we need the drummings. We need the practices by our ancestors, the words, pronunciations, and all these different things. Mr. Granger spoke earlier about Kojo McPherson and the names of our African ancestors and monuments and so forth at Litchfield. And speaking of Kojo McPherson, tomorrow they celebrated the anniversary of Kojo McPherson, I believe the village, Litchfield, and those other villages, surrounding areas out there on the West Coast, Berbice. Good evening to all of you guys out there as well. And so here is where we pull the curtain down. We're a couple of minutes over, but ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much. And to our members of the audience, we really appreciate that you guys took the time out to watch us and listen to us. And some of you may have your own ideas as well. Quickly before we go, Mr. Granger, you made a promise earlier. What's going on?
Yes, I was thinking of winding up the show by pointing out that one of my main objectives in entering office was to develop social cohesion. And it's impossible, if you listen to what Ms. Washington said, Mr. Caesar said, what you've been saying, it's impossible for Guyana to succeed as a peaceful, orderly state without social cohesion. And social cohesion is based on respect. And the contribution made by African Guyanese is not something that could be brushed aside, is not something that can be taken for granted or ignored. That is an important element in respecting among all races, and certainly in building respect for African Guyanese. That is essential to the future progress of Guyana. Thank you.
Well said, and thank you all. Ms. Washington, thank you so much, and give our regards to the folks at your law firm. Hardworking folks. Mr. Caesar, same to you, sir. Our respectable public accountant, all doing great things. And I'm glad that you took the time out to share with us your experiences and so forth. Thank you all so much. Mr. Granger, thank you as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Dalaba, Dankibre, Arsane, even Dokakwa, Takapro. Dalaba, Dankibre, Arsane, even Dokakwa. Come and hear this sweet story that tell the people about life.